Welcome back, everyone. This is David Patrick Carey with Church of the Eternal Logos, and today I want to speak to you guys about my own spiritual journey back to Christianity. And so some of the things that I want to highlight, you may have already heard in previous videos or in previous conversations in some of the podcasts I've done, but I thought it would be useful for some of the new subscribers, but also for you guys that have been with me for a while now, in terms of sharing my own spiritual journey back to Christianity, my own atheistic return, and the various stages that has gone through, which are probably going to be common for a lot of you guys as well. My own movement from traditional Christian Methodism to atheism, to East Asian traditions, to spiritual but not religious, to magic, to psychedelics, to all this stuff that eventually it led for me a return back to Christianity, specifically Orthodox Christianity. And so I wanted to talk about this because I've received a few comments and a couple emails from people who are familiar with my previous channel called Fractal Universe, in which I posted a lot of content related to Terence McKenna, Alan Watts, Timothy Leary, Robert Anton Wilson, Aldous Huxley, really promulgating information and ideas related to psychedelics, the spiritual not religious, New Age ideas, even transhumanism, all this stuff that I thought was so powerful and I thought to be true, I now reject and am antagonistic towards, but they are familiar with that whole worldview, and then they see this new thing that I've been doing in terms of Church of the Eternal Logos and really trying to speak out against a lot of that stuff, and why I believe Christianity to be the one true religion, Orthodox Christianity. So, in attempt to address some of those questions, but also provide content and information for everybody, I'm going to make a video about my whole spiritual journey back to Christianity. And it starts when I was about 19 years old. After I graduated high school, I actually went to a school to play basketball. So it was called Manchester College. It's now called Manchester University. But during high school, I was not an intellectual. I was not an academic. I was none of that. I was not even a good student. I think I graduated high school like a 2.6 GPA, and my focus was athletics. And so I was going to a school to play basketball after high school, and that's really all that mattered. I ended up having a heart murmur, and I wasn't cleared by the time the season's already started. Eventually I was cleared, but I decided that I didn't want to stay at the school. I really didn't like it as much as I thought I was going to, and ended up transferring back home to live with my parents and go to school at IUPUI, Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. And so that's what I did, and it was here where my spiritual journey really begins. So for me, I was moving back home, and I wanted to devote my life to Jesus. And so I was working on this very traditional, conservative, immature Methodist theological framework. And that's the way I grew up, and I never really looked into any other world religions whatsoever. So I decided that I wanted to take a Bible class. And so that first semester at IUPUI, I signed up for a critical Bible class. I didn't know what I was getting into, but it was going to be covering the Old and New Testament. And it was this class, which was much more difficult than any of the other classes I had taken, that semester previous at Manchester. And it really showed the differences between the two Genesis narratives, the relationship between the legend of Gilgamesh and Noah, or commonalities. Talked about the multiple authorship theory related to the Gospels. It went through the whole Bible and basically overturned the apple cart of everything that I thought Christianity was and what I was told and educated on within the Methodist Church. So obviously being a little surprised, a bit angry, I guess, I don't know how to frame it, this obviously led to a rejection of Christianity. And so by the next semester, I was already changing my major to biology. Even though I had not been a good student, I had never really focused on academics. I did pretty good that first semester as like had really no major, just kind of taking general classes plus that Bible class, and thought, you know what I want to do is work with animals. I want to become a zoologist. I saw things like Jeff Corwin, stuff like that on Animal Planet. Like that seems like the ideal career for me. And so the next 2.5 years, basically, I'm a biology major, taking biology courses, biology, cell biology, immunology, embryology, all this stuff. So doing that, and it was about a semester or two later that I took a comparative world religions course. So throughout that time studying biology, I would identify as an atheist. And then I started to compete in martial arts. I started studying Taekwondo, which is a Korean martial art, mostly focused on legs and kicking, but started studying that, started going to competitions, and really was interested in kind of East Asian culture. So I took this comparative world religions course and really got infatuated with Taoism, Buddhism, and a little bit of Hinduism, specifically the Advaita Vedanta tradition, this one that kind of the non-dualistic form of Hinduism. And being kind of enamored with the aesthetics, with the foreignness of the ideas, with kind of this new conception of religion, and then my interest in martial arts and kind of romantic idea of East Asia, I was like, you know what? I want to go to China. I want to study Mandarin. And so I'm a biology major. I'm studying religion. I decided to get a minor in religious studies at this time. So I'm about in the tail end of kind of my sophomore year. And I spend a year studying Mandarin, and then I go to China for 2 summers, Sun Yat-sen University, Zhongshan Daxue in Guangzhou, the Guangdong province. And so certainly I've moved from, and at this time, so before I go to China for the first time, I'm already being introduced to Terence McKenna, diving into the Alan Watts stuff, Robert Anton Wilson, and really becoming a sort of spiritual but not religious person, really mostly interested in East Asian traditions though, but getting my toes wet with psychedelics. And so a little caveat here, some of you guys are going to be followers of Jay Dyer, who I'm a big fan of, and he's mentioned his LSD experience where he had a sort of traumatic negative trip. Me, on the other hand, basically for the first 2 years of doing psychedelics, I never had a negative or bad experience. And so for me, there was never that immediate kind of revolt against that worldview. I continued to kind of get deeper and deeper into it. And mind you, because I didn't read, I wasn't an intellectual, I didn't really have the analytical tools to criticize or understand what I was getting into like maybe I do now. So going to China, I spent 2 summers in China, and I had a great time. I learned so much. But what was one of the takeaways and conclusions of that is I'm getting ready to start my senior year. This is the summer after my junior year. And I realized I knew I wanted to go to graduate school. I knew I wanted to be a professor. This is the framework in my head once I was doing all this biology. I want to be a professor. That's who I want to be. And that after spending 2 summers in China, I realized, devoting my life to Chinese scholarship, which was something I was contemplating, devoting my life to recovering, discovering, and really writing about ancient China. When I go there, and the Chinese people who actually live in China are materialistic, consumeristic, basically capitalistic, if you will, much more so than I was expecting. I had this really over-romantic idea of East Asia and China. And so I get there, and it's like, man, I'm more interested in their history than they are. And there was just this major disconnect. It's like the culture wasn't what I thought it was going to be. Mind you, I had a great time. I loved my study abroad experiences over in China, but it wasn't what I thought it was. And so I was, again, studying martial arts, competing in martial arts, becoming infatuated with East Asian traditions, taking psychedelics, listening to Alan Watts. And this really led to my last year of school, where I was really focused on theories of magic. And so one of my professors at IUPUI was really introducing me to the Western esoteric tradition. So because I was familiar with psychedelics, because I was familiar with Alan Watts and Terence McKenna, I could talk to her about these ideas. And she was familiar with all these people. She was familiar with all these ideas. And she recommended me these books and these authors. And one of them was her teacher, Jeffrey Kripal, who is the lead. He's a major scholar at Rice University or University of Rice. I think it's Rice University. I'm not sure. But over at Rice, he has one of the only Gnostic programs in the United States. And so, which is totally focused on Western esoteric traditions to get a PhD in them. So, she was giving me his books, and then there's Wouter Hanegraaff. He's like kind of the leader, the head scholar in basically the field of Western esoteric traditions. And then there's people like Catherine Albanese. She's an American scholar who also contributes to sort of Western esoteric traditions. And I read her book on Republic of Mind about the kind of esoteric magical roots of America. And I just became infatuated with this stuff. I loved Hanegraaff's book on the New Age. In fact, I have that somewhere. Anyways, I'm using that for research. But this was my worldview. I was a senior. I'm writing a capstone paper on the theories of magic, talking about Tyler and Fraser and Durkheim and all these different individuals and the various theories of magic all the way up kind of to the present moment. And that was my capstone. And I knew I didn't want to do anything with China anymore. And I knew I was going to graduate school. So I kind of reoriented my studies. Again, I'm spiritual but not religious, deep in the psychedelic spiritual culture, very interested in magic. And I go to the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign to study early Christianity and shamanism. So there was a professor, Dr. Layton. He was an early Christianity professor. He also had a class on Gnosticism. So this is where I worked with him to study some of my Koine Greek, read texts like the Shepherd of Hermas in Greek, read Revelation, read the Gospel of John. We worked with him regularly. That was one side of the study, was early Christianity in Greek, and then the other side was with Professor Dr. Treat on shamanism, on Native American traditions. And I took, I think, 3 classes with him on Native American traditions and wrote papers on shamanism leading up to a final paper on psychedelic shamanism, the use of psychedelics, and the role of language. So that was one paper. The other one with Dr. Layton led to, again, mind you where I am at spiritually. I wrote a paper using some of my elementary Greek skills. Again, I lost most of that. I can read Greek in terms of the pronunciation. I may not know all the conjugations and the declensions anymore, but I wrote a paper on the Gospel of Mark, and the new Christology I was arguing for was Jesus as a shaman. Jesus as a shaman, because I was familiar with a book by Morton Smith, who is a homosexual scholar, I believe during the 60s, who wrote a book called Jesus the Magician. And it's an interesting book, although scholars don't really take it seriously at all, in which he tries to make the claim that Jesus was just a Mediterranean magician, a Jewish magician that was kind of representative of the climate in which he existed in. So I read this book. I thought it was very interesting. Again, mind you, I'm interested in magic, all this stuff, psychedelics, spirituality, perennialism. And I was like, oh, this is great. So I write a paper against his characterization or his Christology as Jesus as a magician. I write a Christology of him as a shaman. So the Gospel of Mark focuses on Jesus' divinity being represented through his healings. I associate the whole healing tradition of a shaman with Jesus, with the control of nature or weather, with shamanism, with the words of power. So the narrative of the story, or the little girl of Jairus, who is the leader of a synagogue. She's dead, sleeping. Jesus comes in, tells her, little girl, get up. And in the Mark version, it says Talitha Kumi, which is an Aramaic word of power, saying little girl, get up. So Mark preserves the Aramaic in a handful of instances in his gospel that aren't in the other gospels. And I was trying to use that as an example of words of power, theories of magic, theories of shamanism, and this type of stuff. Now, of course, I reject all this, but I'm just trying to characterize where my mind was. This also led to me not wanting to be a historical textual scholar. So even though I wrote this paper, I did all this research, I realized, geez, I do not want to be a textual scholar, just like I realized I didn't want to be a Chinese scholar. And so I'm trying to rethink of how can I recast what my studies will be for my graduate school. So now I'm applying to schools for my doctoral degree, and I'm thinking something along the lines of spiritual but not religious, looking at neo-paganism, looking at the appropriation of religious symbols by those who identify as spiritual but not religious, and that's kind of what I went with. So I applied to the school that I ended up getting accepted by, the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California, basically saying, hey, I'd love to study people who identify as spiritual, not religious, and how they appropriate various symbols from world traditions, what those say, and then maybe larger understandings of that subsetted group, because there's not a lot of scholarship on spiritual but not religious, even though it's a fast-growing phenomenon and demographic in the United States and the Western world generally. So then I go to Berkeley to study people who are spiritual but not religious and their appropriation of symbols. That's what I went there for. Now, again, still in the same place, been using psychedelics for spiritual tools or spiritual insights, if you will, however you want to understand that. Very interested in magic. And while I was at Illinois, I began to practice sigil magic a couple times. So it's not like I dove into it much, but sigil magic, for those of you who may not be familiar with, a way to do that is to come up with a desire. For me, it was things that, I wanted at the moment, but let's just take a random example. Say you wanted $1,000 extra at the end of the month. It has to be something that's not too outside your reach. It's outside your reach, but not too far, is the idea. And then you can create a sigil for it. And so you would write down the desire. So it'd be, my highest desire is to have an extra $1,000 at the end of the month. Say that was what it was. You would write that down. You would go through and mark out all the vowels. The vowels are just phonetic. They don't contain meaning. Consonants contain meaning. And so then you would have a series of consonants, and you'd go out and mark through all the ones that repeat. So now you have a series of consonants, probably about 10 to 20, somewhere around there, and you create a symbol using all those consonants. So in this symbol, every letter can be found, a K, an H, an M, an O, but when you look at the symbol, you don't see any of those specific letters. But the constitution of that symbol is made up by all those letters of meaning. And now you have a physical symbol that represents all that meaning that you wrote into that sentence. This is the theory of sigils. And then you can charge the sigil, whether you charge it by looking at it. There's another way to charge it by masturbating and looking at it while you're in the point of orgasm to really submit it in the unconscious mind, because the corpus callosum fuses the right and left hemisphere during the state of orgasm. There's other ways to get other people to see the sigil regularly. That's another way to charge it, to get it in other people's minds subconsciously. But I digress. But this is kind of the theory of sigils, and I used this a couple times, and things happened. So I actually got what it was that I asked for in my sigil, and this I thought was really interesting. So this, in my mind, led me to think, oh, well, magic is real. Maybe we can affect the world. Maybe the real secret of everything is that man has the ability to perform magic, and that magic isn't this real negative thing, but it's our innate power, right? This is kind of where my mind was. Anyways, that kind of framed my spiritual practice. And then, of course, the use of psychedelics, and then reading and studying all the world religions and having a perennialistic framework. Okay, so that really frames my mind. Now, in 2017, when I began to move to Berkeley, the only thing that's really changing is my politics. So my religious worldview is really kind of staying the same, psychedelic, perennialistic, but my politics become a little bit more conservative. This is this is 2017. This is Trump. Not that Trump influenced my worldview or anything, but my stance on guns, my stance on family, these things, I realized were a little bit more conservative, and didn't see that conflating with the larger kind of presuppositions of my worldview. So fast forward, I moved to Berkeley, having had my politics maybe become a little bit more conservative, even though everything else is basically the same. Then I get to Berkeley. Then I see the conclusions of all these ideas I have in my head about the perennialism, about the use of drugs, how great drugs are. Oh, we need to legalize all drugs, all this stuff. And I see the culture that really takes all these conclusions to their end, or takes all these ideas to their conclusion, to their ends. and it really started to wake me up. And then I'm going to class. Now I'm in the graduate theological unit, and I'm seeing professors, I'm seeing students being totally open about their animosity towards European people, towards Western civilization. And what I realized for them, the reason why the European and the Western civilization is connected, even though maybe I'm not a promoter of Western civilization anymore in the same sense, is for them, it all connects back to Christianity. So what they're in opposition to is the Christian history and heritage of Europe, which then they're kind of localizing in the Western framework. Not very, very, very little discussion at all about Orthodoxy or Eastern Orthodoxy. So I see this for the first semester. This is also kind of the peak hysteria of Jordan Peterson. The fall of 2017 is where Jordan Peterson is like this bigger than life figure. He's on everything, and he's representing kind of the Western European white man standing up to the progressive, political correctness and all this stuff, the postmodern left, right? And again, my apparatus wasn't large enough to really understand all these things in their correct context. So thought that, okay, that was great, but this was where I was moving, right? This kind of Jordan Peters, I was moving in this direction. These, before even he came on the scene, that's where my values, my mind was starting to go. So I'm in Berkeley. I'm just seeing all this stuff happen. I'm seeing the animosity towards all this stuff. I'm seeing the particular animosity towards traditional forms of Christianity. Yet, at the same time, the same circle of people who are critiquing traditional forms of Christianity are, in fact, themselves conservative Muslims, are, in fact, themselves homosexuals, are, in fact, themselves, this or that. And it's like, what is going on here? What is with this alliance of people who all have the same worldview that somehow European-based people and Christian civilization is the scourge of the planet? So this first semester, this is all contextualized in my mind. This is I'm seeing all this, and then in terms of my research, I'm getting into a book called Psychedelic Gospels. And the Psychedelic Gospels is a book written by Jerry and Julie Brown. Jerry Brown is a former anthropologist at a university in Florida. I forget which one specifically, but maybe it been in Central Florida. I'm not sure. But his book, The Psychedelic Gospels, has all these frescoes of these paintings that appear to have Amanita muscaria mushrooms. The one in Hildesheim, Germany, has one fresco of an Amanita muscaria, but then strands. A mycologist said that the strands that were depicted in the kind of the various reliefs, the bronze sculptures that they had, were actually a traditional strand of psychedelic mushroom that was there locally in Germany. Anyways, the whole book was basically arguing that there may have been this secret Eucharistic esoteric tradition where they were consuming psychedelic mushrooms as the Eucharist. Now, this was extremely fascinating to me. I never heard any of this. I had never seen these frescoes. And again, I'm totally embedded within the psychedelic spiritual worldview. So for that semester, that was going to be my research. So I researched it, everything I could about it, really dove into the works of Carl Ruck, who's a classicist, who's identified or he's known for psychedelic scholarship. He was there with the Road of Eleusis with Albert Hoffman and R. Gordon Wasson in terms of talking about the Eleusinian mysteries and their relationship potentially to ergot, which was a sort of LSD alkaline, similar alkaline structure that they could drink this beverage and have psychedelic experiences. This was the whole thesis of the Road to Eleusis. So being familiar with all this stuff, I'm diving deep into it. And then in my paper, what I realized is that it wasn't a sort of esoteric, secret Eucharistic tradition that was there in Christianity with frescoes in Germany and Spain and France, and then even within the Psalter of Canterbury, with even in the Canterbury Cathedral, and even within a church within Turkey and Italy. So what I realized is that all these things were created within the same time period, basically from the 900s to the 1300s. And I started to understand the French movement so the movement of these ideas into Spain, into southern Germany, into southern France, are related to the Cathars. The Cathars are a heretical group will eventually be killed in the Inquisition of Catholics that had come from the Holy Land during the Crusades and basically had come across a Manichaean, a Gnostic practice of inducing psychedelic mushrooms. And so it was known that the Manichaeans, this is work done by Carl Ruck, that the Manichaeans use mushrooms. They were known in the ancient world for their obsession with eating mushrooms. So then I realized that this whole thing that's being documented in the psychedelic gospels is really just a kind of medieval resurgence of a Gnostic practice that was, there in the ancient world, tied to the Mithraic rites, the Mithraic cults, and all this stuff, the use of Hayoma that went back to Persia, and Zoroastrianism, which then is theorized potentially, but this is, again, getting into kind of iffy connections and scholarship, goes back to Soma, and Soma being one of the three Vedic deities in ancient Hinduism, and Soma being identified as this psychedelic hallucinogenic brew that the Brahmins and the priest would ingest. Nobody knows exactly what that is. Theories are abound. But this is kind of what my first semester of scholarship was really focusing on. And now I see, okay, this has to do with the Cathars. This is a historical contextual phenomenon. This isn't a great secret, a great esoteric practice within the churches. But I wonder if it's an Eastern Orthodox. And at the time, my girlfriend was Eastern Orthodox, but I wasn't, she wasn't really too into the church or anything like that. It was more of a cultural practice, and I didn't know anything about it. But I said, okay, this next semester, my second semester at the GTU, I'm going to take a course with the Orthodox on theology and history. Of course, there was very, very little history. The history was the development of the theology, and at the time, I'm a non-believer, right? I'm spiritual but not religious. I'm psychedelic. I'm so beyond these traditional forms of religion. And so I take this course with the Eastern Orthodox, and I'm embedded within their theology. So I'm reading Lasky, Florovsky, Luth, Zazoulis, Bulgakov, Stanilow. So where I'm reading all these people, and it's really, really dense for me to first get into the theology. This is really dense stuff, but the concept of logos kept coming up over and over again, and I found it very, very intriguing. Now, again, mind you, I'm non-religious, so this is something I'm just going to appropriate probably from this tradition. I find it very interesting. Of course, no evidence of psychedelics whatsoever, despite what really prompted me is thinking, I might discover something here in Eastern Orthodoxy is, if you're familiar, most of you probably aren't, but R. Gordon Wasson and his wife, Valentina Pavlovna, they wrote a book on mushrooms and the history of Russia and mushrooms or something. I forget the title of it. It's a very difficult book to purchase. It's very expensive, where they basically document the kind of Slavic culture related to mushrooms, even psychedelic mushrooms, which is tied to Siberian shamanism, all this stuff. So Russia has a deep linguistic, cultural, and even ritual connection to mushrooms. And this was in their book, and so because of that it was tied to Russia and the Slavic culture, I thought, maybe I would find it in Eastern Orthodoxy. So that's why I went to that class. Then the theology I read, I found very dense, very difficult to read at times. Some of the hardest reading I was doing in graduate school was reading Eastern Orthodox theology without having any understanding of what I was reading, and it became really, really fascinating for me, especially this idea of logos and order and language, and how this relates to history and how this relates to the incarnation. And I just wasn't familiar. I knew logos. I've heard of the concept. Terence McKenna talked about it as a sort of demiurge of providing insight. He referred to Philo of Alexandria a lot in terms of language, moving beyond a domain of just being heard into a physical domain. So the more perfect logos would move from just being heard to being seen. This is how he was tying to ayahuasca and shamanism and visible language during those ecstatic experiences. So that was really my context for logos. And then I'm reading this Orthodox theology, and it's really much more expansive than the way that I understood it. I thought, well, that's interesting. Certainly, I'm not a Christian. I wouldn't get into any of that stuff. And then that leads to the summer. And of course, politics. I'm becoming more traditional. I'm becoming more conservative. I'm seeing how the progressive and the progressive worldview is tied to even spiritual ideas, things that I'm talking about. I'm seeing how the feminism and the transcendence of boundaries and the rejection of culture and the rejection of any sort of authority and the emphasis on oneself and their own phenomenological experience, all these things that Terence McKenna was talking about, I see, geez, I can see how all that stuff is then embedded within sort of progressive leftist political culture. I was connecting then the 60s counterculture with his ideas, with then what I was in opposition to. So it was the end of that semester that I really fully understood that what I was in opposition to in Berkeley was the whole counterculture being in power. And so all these people that had these views that maybe I didn't agree with, they were really the products of the 1960s counterculture on the West Coast, in California, in the Bay Area, and now they are the establishment. Now they're the ones that are in power. They're the ones that hold the seats. And it just started to make me really question everything that I was putting forth in regards to the YouTube channel, in regards to where I thought I was going, what I thought to be true. And so I didn't know what was going on at this point. My mind was kind of bombarded. I just didn't have a context. I knew that, wow, a lot of the things that I once believed in, I know that I don't believe in that anymore. I know that can't be true. I'm looking at the politics. I'm critical of Trump, but I'm seeing, I don't have Trump derangement syndrome. I'm seeing this sort of political thing happening, the dialectic. I just didn't know how to understand all this stuff. And then I start my next semester where I'm becoming much more interested in Christianity, almost just at a cultural value, just to connect with my ancestors, just connect with Western civilization. That's what I kept saying, Western civilization. Even though I had done the Eastern Orthodox class, my understanding of Christianity was a little bit better. Now I knew about the Filioque, I knew about the councils, I knew about a lot of the history. So then I have that semester, I'm taking mind and brain, I'm taking person and neuroscience, and I'm over at a Dominican school. So 2 of my 3 courses are at a Dominican theological school that focuses on philosophy. Dominicans obviously get their philosophy from Thomas Aquinas. They're big Thomists. So a lot of the men that I was interacting with and discussing theology, because I was still very infatuated, I really enjoyed a lot of this Eastern Orthodox stuff, and it was coloring my mind on a lot of things. So when I would speak theology with the Catholics, with the Thomists, I was always coming from an Orthodox perspective. And then I knew quite a bit about Gnosticism, which maybe they didn't know. So that was kind of where I was coming from in Christianity. Look about all this Eastern Orthodox stuff. Look at all this Gnostic stuff and challenging their. We would just have fun conversations and stuff like that. And then I had a psychedelic experience that really changed everything for me regarding the Logos. I had a high dose LSD experience in Berkeley in my apartment. And it became radically apparent that I needed to follow the Logos. This was kind of the message that I was receiving. I was downloading, if you will, however you want to understand that. Or maybe I was being inspired by the Holy Spirit and being led into an entirely new direction. And I think this occurs too because the worldview I previously had is basically crumbling apart. And what's coming to fulfill it now is being led by the Spirit, and the message was to follow the Logos. And so these things that I've talked about recently in regards to synchronicity and divine providence, metaphysics for fractal mathematics, sacred geometry, pi-phi, all this stuff, this is what is being connected in my mind through this deep psychedelic experience in 2018 that, oh my gosh, this all makes sense with regard to this idea of Logos that I have read the semester before and all this Eastern Orthodox theology. And I kept thinking, man, it's Logos. This experience is like everything that I had thought of, that I thought was sacred, that I thought was important, was being recontextualized in the light of Logos. And it was this LSD experience that just changed everything for me. It was like, wow. And again, the message, the takeaway, it kept follow the logos. And so it was after this LSD experience that I began to go to church regularly, or much more regularly. At least I hadn't gone to church in years, since I was 19 years old, since the beginning of this experience when I was as an undergraduate. So then I started to go to Catholic churches with my Thomist friends, the Latin Mass. It'd be traditional Catholic services. And then I'd go to Eastern Orthodox services, either by myself or with another gentleman who was Serbian. He was an Eastern Orthodox, and he was a theologian. He was actually getting his PhD in theology, Eastern Orthodoxy particularly. So I'd go with him, and everything started to change. So that's last semester of 2018 is when everything in my life really changed. It's like a new lens was put on my eyes. I was seeing everything from a different perspective, especially after the psychedelic experience. So then fast forward throughout that semester, it's 11/11/18. I remember this day exactly. 11/11/18 is the day that I gave my life to Christ, if you will. I gave my life to Jesus. I devoted myself to Christianity because it just kept coming back, and I started to read some of the church fathers, and it just resonated with me. It felt so real that that's what it led to. Is like at night, a kind of tearful conversion, a repentance, and an atheistic return back to Christianity. 11/11/18 is the night that happened. And so from then I would go to church and do like that. And then it was that February where I created this YouTube channel because I was in disagreement with the stuff I was producing on my other YouTube channel, which was the way in which I made money to live in California. I didn't have a job. I had student loans. I had a little bit of money I got from student loans to live on, and the majority of my income was coming from this continual making of videos of Terence McKenna and Alan Watts and Timothy Leary and Robert Anton Wilson, and just putting out those videos basically 3 times a week. And it was doing that I actually made money, and that's how I lived. And now I didn't even want to do that. I didn't want to make those videos anymore. I disagreed with it, but I had to make it to even pay my rent and to live there. And so in February, I decided that I wanted to make my own YouTube channel because it became very apparent to me from my classes, from my interactions with my professors, with other students, that I didn't want to go down the traditional route of being a scholar and trying to get a tenureship position in the academy. That whole route was not going to work for me. I wasn't going to sacrifice my individual voice. I knew that they didn't support where I was moving to in my worldview and more traditional values, especially now that I started going to particularly Eastern Orthodox services around the Bay Area. I just knew that I needed to find a way to have a career online. And so for me, I needed to make a YouTube channel, a new YouTube channel, where I can voice my opinions. The emphasis is on not Terence McKenna, not perennialism, not Alan Watts, not kind of these just superficial spiritual ideas that make people feel good, but if you actually take out their logical conclusions, make no sense, are totally incoherent, that can't be true. And so that's when I started this YouTube channel. And that was in February. I made a few YouTube videos, and I would make some, once in a while, maybe once a week. Maybe a couple of weeks would go by, then I'd make another one. And it wasn't until the beginning of the series on Logos, the development of Logos in August, where I feel I was taking this very seriously, because it was in September that I could not handle the Bay Area anymore. I could not handle the culture I was living in. I could not handle just the general context of everything in Berkeley, everything in the Bay Area, the expense, the culture, the homelessness, the drugs, the transgenderism, the homosexuality. I had been reprimanded for just bringing up logical inconsistencies with transgenderism, like bisexuality, the transitioning from one gender to another, and then the same idea spouted by the same people that there's infinite numbers of genders. Then once you bring in biology and chromosomes, it's just crazy. It was just crazy, and I actually had to go speak with some of my professors because of my ideas and what I was saying. So I knew I couldn't stay in the traditional path of becoming a professor in the academy, which was my goal the whole time, through the undergraduate, through the master's, into the doctorate. And now that's not what I want at all. And now it's like I'm viewing the world from this Christian worldview, and everything's making more sense. Everything is connecting. The dots are connecting. The meaning is coming into my life. The responsibility and changing my habits, whether that be towards lust or pornography or the things that I say, the things that I promote, just becoming much more conscientious about that stuff, and then trying to change my patterns and my habits. It felt right. I was praying regularly. That was the first thing that really kind of, the domino effect is that I would start praying before I went to bed at night. Before I even identified as Christian or anything like that, I started to pray, and the synchronicities, the stuff would begin to happen. And that's basically then where the story is now. Is in September, I've moved back home to Indiana, and I am now finishing my doctoral studies. I'm using the library at IUPUI where I did my undergraduate studies. And I'm making videos, trying to make videos 3 times a week and build this platform. My website should be coming out pretty soon to have a career online. I want to do scholarship. I want to be a professor. I want to write books. I want to teach classes. But I want to build a platform online in which I can do that. And then if there's universities or schools or Christian colleges that will allow me to teach from a traditional worldview, then I would be very happy to do that. And that's really where I'm at now. And why orthodoxy then is because philosophically, and this is a whole nother video to get into in terms of absolute divine simplicity, the collapsing of dialectics, the equating God's essence to a single substance or a simple substance, which a lot of people do by equating God with consciousness or the universe or whatever it is. Orthodoxy is always collapsing the dialectics and the theology from the Logos. This Logos theology is just so powerful. Once you get into it, once you understand it, once you see the energy essence distinction, the Logos logoi, and then you begin to, for me, all this stuff was symbolic at first, but seeing all the symbolic connections, the archetypal connections, now it's in no way is this stuff just symbolic. Like this, for me, this is where I'm finding all my meaning. And so I confess that I'm new to orthodoxy. I'm new to a lot of the stuff that I talk to you guys about, and I don't want to be the kind of convert zeal and be kind of zealous about the stuff that I talk about just because it's new and exciting. But I take it really seriously, and I read a lot of books about this stuff. And I've incorporated it into my life, and I'm joining an Antiochian church here in Indiana, near where I live. So, to me, this has been some of the greatest experiences in my life, and now I see this entire trajectory, this entire movement from atheism to the East Asians, to the spiritual but not religious, through the magic and the Western esotericism, into and then the psychedelics, and then into Eastern Orthodoxy is really a divine providential journey that allows me and equips me with all this knowledge related to all these other world religions, related to magic and Western esotericism, that will allow me to build bridges for people who are in the same place that I was, and build a bridge that can bring them into orthodoxy, that we can begin to talk about systematic theology, high-level theology, and why the ideas of the Eastern Orthodox Church are true. So that really is my spiritual journey right there. I know it doesn't necessarily answer the question of why Christianity, but that it has to do with Logos. It has to do with Logos theology. It has to do with this grand understanding of whether it be archetypes, whether it be the origin of language, of metaphysics for logic, order, morality, truth, justice, all these things in which I was perceiving in Berkeley as being direct oppositions to what people were really advocating for. And then their direct opposition to Christianity, to the original Orthodox traditional Christianity. And what really got me, besides the Eastern Orthodox course I took while I was in Berkeley, the only people who were really standing up against the LGBTQ stuff at the GTU were the Orthodox Church and the Dominicans. And the Dominicans, the Thomists, they were the only ones that were really taking a stand and being traditional in the worldview. I mean, the Buddhist, the Hindu school, all the Protestant member schools, all in favor of the LGBTQ. Big, the Protestant churches, the Anglican and the Episcopalian churches were the worst in terms of their kind of celebration of trans kids and all this stuff. I mean, I found it disgusting. Of course, then you find out, oh, well, the minister is a homosexual. And that's why he has his husband sit on the front pew and then he pets his puppy literally while he gives his sermon. I mean, it's like I just was connecting all this stuff at a theological level. And the more I read Orthodoxy, the more it all made sense about nous, about morality, about man's will versus God's will, about magic. So being repentful for all the sigil magic that I did. And sorry, last thing that I wanted to say too is that first semester when I got to Berkeley, I went to a Gnostic Mass, and I should probably make a separate video about this actually. But I went to a Gnostic Mass, and that also totally opened my eyes to magic and kind of where that was leading to, and man's will versus God's will, and all this stuff. So I will save that story for another video. I'll do that this week. I'll do a video just on my experience at a Gnostic Mass. So, yeah, so that basically concludes, guys. I apologize for rambling, but try to share and encapsulate my whole journey to you guys. And just the last year and a half of my life has been so rich in meaning. And I just thank God every day for exposing me to the Eastern Orthodox tradition, even though at the time I was so in opposition to the kind of these theological understandings. And I kept telling my professor when I'd read the theology, when I read Zazoulis, or I was like, I mean, I get it, but I'm not into all this, it's kind of symbolic for me because I wasn't a believer. And she's like, what? They're not talking symbolically, and I just didn't grasp it. It wasn't true for me. It wasn't living until it got incorporated into my mind, and then it started to match up with my lived experience. And then I'd read more, and then I'd read Maximus the Confessor. Like the first book that I got is this one, The Cosmic Mystery of Jesus Christ by Maximus the Confessor. Whoa, pretty wild stuff once I started to see that there's a whole cosmic theology, that the Logos is not just this thing right here on this planet or localized in this. No, this is a larger theology, and that really shaped my life. And so hopefully what I'll do this week then is talk about this Gnostic Mass. I'll make a video on the Gnostic Mass I attended, but then maybe why Christianity and not other religions. That would probably better answer the questions actually that were posed to me in the email and some of the comments than this video. But this video certainly gives a rundown of how I got to where I'm at. So anyways, thank you guys for watching. Let me know what you guys think. Maybe there's some similarities, some differences between your journey and my journey. Let me know in the comments section. Please like, share, and subscribe this video. Let me know what you guys think. And again, I always appreciate your guys' love and support. And until next time, which should be Wednesday, I will have a video up on Wednesday. Until then, as always, God bless.